My name is Joanna Gongla. I'm a fellow here at the Lauterbach Center. And I have the pleasure of welcoming our distinguished guest, Professor Balakrishnan, who is an associate professor of law and development at the Department of Urban Studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's also the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. He founded the Program on Human Rights and Justice at MIT and the Displacement Research and Action Network. He is recognized as a leading participant in the Third World Approach to International Law Network of Scholars and is one of its founders. He holds an SJD from Harvard Law School and also a law degree from India. And Professor Balakrishnan will discuss the global housing crisis from an international legal perspective. So let's welcome Professor. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Just a clarification that I ended my mandate as the UN Special Rapporteur about 20 days ago, so former UN Special Rapporteur at this point. So 4 days after that, I was here. So I guess this is the decompression moment. Because now I have only one full-time job as opposed to two. So thank you all. Thank you for your introduction. Thank you to the Lauterbach Center, both for this lecture and also for hosting me for a few months here. It's a much needed sort of time for me to step back a little bit and reflect on what has been a very intense 6 years as a special rapporteur, and to sort of plot my next moves, both in terms of writing and also and any other plans I have. So in terms of the mandate itself, just to say, first of all, I was not a housing expert as such before being appointed as a housing rapporteur. So why was it selected? Well, first of all, how do rapporteurs get selected or appointed? I don't know if many of you know this, but UN rapporteurs are part of the network of independent experts who all of whom work with the UN system. Regional systems also have similar independent experts. And almost in all cases, independent experts self-nominate themselves for positions and don't get sponsored by states or by any particular actors. Of course, once you apply, then they take a close look at you and your record, both in terms of substantive competence, but also in terms of independence, political independence. And so as long as you look like you're competent and you're not compromised, you might be shortlisted for an interview. After that, it depends. Many other intangibles enter the picture, including, balance between regions and geographies and gender and so many other balances enter the picture. So, while I had a long-standing interest in economic, social, and cultural rights more broadly, I was not particularly into this or that right. Not like a food expert or a housing expert. And then the other thing was I had had a long engagement with the issue of displacement and evictions, particularly since the 90s, when I got involved in these issues as human rights advisor to the World Commission on Dams, which was a multi-stakeholder initiative that attempted to sort of take a close look at the increasing ecological but social damage done by large infrastructure projects, chiefly among whom dams, while also costing an arm and a leg, usually several orders of time more than what they sell, what they promise you. So they're not a good bang for the buck, essentially. And so this concern has been going for decades. And this World Commission on Dams came together in the 90s I played a role as human rights advisor, and that got me really exposed to the realities of mass displacement that was happening all in the name of ostensibly good things like development objectives, increasing agricultural yield or bringing water supply to water starved areas, or electricity production, et cetera, et cetera, flood control. I mean, dams do serve very important functions, but the way they were getting built and the incredible costs, that are being incurred as a result, and the total blindness to these issues was quite fascinating for me and taught me several things about all the damage that we do in the name of good objectives. Uh, and I was able to translate a lot of these insights into international law. So a lot of my work in international law itself started by sort of taking a critical look at all the good stuff about international law, whether it's human rights or development or so. What might be some of the question for me was what might be some of the things that are not visible? What are the hidden costs of international law, international systems, international ideologies, beliefs, practices, etc. So I came more from that angle. But once I took on the job as a rapporteur, it became quite obvious to me that many of the central challenges that people are facing in terms of how to get to live safely in a house and how to keep your house safely for the longer term actually went to the core issues that I was always interested in, and then other issues where I saw that as an opportunity to learn a lot, and I did learn a lot over those 6 years. Things about which I didn't know much, but it was a great opportunity to learn. So I would also say that the rapporteur position is also, especially in technical areas like economic and social rights, can be a great opportunity to do a very deep, dive into the nuts and bolts of technicalities, policy dimensions, and others that usually international lawyers at our level don't do. So, because that's left to the housing lawyers, for example, or housing policy experts. But it is really going to avoid these issues if you're a rapporteur. Um, so I also was struck that I was the first professional international lawyer to hold the mandate. The previous three, since the mandate was created in 2000, had been either urban planners or domestic, housing rights lawyers, but not really with the background in public international law. So the question is, what was I going to do different, really, as a public international lawyer? So I thought, okay, I didn't set out to with that idea. The idea was to do as best a job as I could as a housing rapporteur, whether or not it will contribute anything to international law or teach me something about international law that I didn't know before was a side benefit, that. So, so this talk is part of the initial process of figuring out if there was such a side benefit. Haven't learned anything new. Did I contribute anything? So, some very preliminary sort of exchanges with you. I haven't quite figured out, what to make of some of these, but so consider it in that spirit. So first of all, the fact that there is a housing crisis is almost widely acknowledged almost in all major countries now. Everybody, whether they're ordinary people or political parties and politicians running for office, seem to find housing as the number one issue. These are issues on which elections have won or lost. And housing in especially global north countries is part of a broader conversation about the question of affordability, cost of living crisis, essentially. Almost everything is expensive, and housing tops the list because it's the biggest chunk of your salary or your earnings. And this is creating political problems. In global north countries, it has led to the rise of far right parties who find it convenient to blame, for example, migrants for the housing crisis. And they've been quite successful in winning elections in one place or the other, including right here, as we saw recently. So the question is, there is no doubt that there is a housing crisis judged in terms of this one issue, affordability. But let's just say that housing crisis is global. It has many dimensions. it's not just about this one issue. So I just want to make that point at first that there is, in fact, a housing crisis, and it's a global crisis. You know, it's widely shared and felt. Uh, uh, well, one could say that, well, in that housing crisis, in a sense, is not different from any other crisis, which also seem to be widely felt and global. Where they're living in a situation of what many call poly crisis. There are intersecting crises of ecological, security, economic, medical, social, or some would say even spiritual or cultural crises, especially with the introduction of technology, artificial intelligence, the sense of alienation, social disarticulation that has been quite widely acknowledged already. So housing crisis, perhaps it's at the confluence of all of these crises. It's more the result of many of these crises coming together, intersecting in complicated ways, rather than as a standalone crisis. But whatever it is, that is a housing crisis, then it's global. Like there's a global food crisis, or a global employment crisis. Unemployment is so widely a huge problem right now. So the dimensions of the housing crisis are many. That is how do we know that there's a housing crisis? Well, I mentioned one of them, affordability. And see, when you take on a job as an rapporteur, you are given an opportunity to kind of specify what are going to be your substantive priorities over the next 6 years of your mandate. And you get a chance to articulate them. These substantive priorities are themes, issues like affordable housing crisis, for example, on which you get to write reports. Rapporteurs write 2 reports per year. One report to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, another report to the General Assembly. And these reports emerge from, of course, your own substantive knowledge and expertise, but they're not your library or research-based books alone, or volumes or reports or papers, whatever you call them. They're also based on a careful listening process and collection of information and feedback, because every report is preceded by a long process of, putting out a call for inputs from states, local governments, especially specialized institutions, and also, of course, civil society actors, academics, such as many of you. And you get a lot of submissions, often hundreds of submissions as a result, multiple languages. So we, with my 2 staff, have to figure out how to swim through all of that to absorb the key elements in them, so we do justice to what we're hearing. So in that sense, they're also based on what we might call as original research, because of some of the principal primary research, because a lot of the inputs that we get, for example, from, say, civil society groups come from primary research from the, say, testimonies of victims that we ourselves are not able to listen directly, but you cannot ignore that. And often, even inputs that we get from governments are often much, much more detailed than what's in their public domain. So it can be quite surprisingly detailed. Like some submissions run to 30, 40 pages, for example. So it's not a joke to swim through these submissions. And so the reports, in that sense, reflect both the not just the current state of knowledge in an expert sense, but also the current reality as tested in the real world, both from the perspective of policymakers, government, but also from the perspective of those who are the receiving end of policies. So this is quite a fascinating sort of experience for me, because I was always writing traditional academic articles. Of course, many of them are based on empirical work I had done, primary work, including working with communities, for example, to develop kind of a more of a socio-legal approach to international law. But doing socio-legal work is different from, this kind of listening process. So that's the other difference, I would say, with this position. So what were some of the major dimensions of the housing crisis that I saw when I started in 2020? Well, 2020, I started in May. COVID-19 had already hit a month earlier, which I did not expect would be hijacking the first several months of my mandate. So actually, my first report to the General Assembly that year in October, I ended up writing on COVID-19, although that was not my plan. But a pandemic like that had completely inverted the reality of everything for people around the world, and hundreds of thousands were ill or dying, and the impacts had been terrible around the world. So I did a report on the pandemic, also because housing was at the heart of the conversation over the pandemic. Because remember, all the advice or advisories that we got about COVID-19 was stay at home. Stay at home, keep yourself safe, wash your hands, maintain distancing. All this assumes, of course, that you do have a home and that there is capacity and safe distancing that is possible in your homes, and that there is access to, say, water to wash your hands or keep yourself clean. A lot depends on the not just having a home, but having an adequate home, a home with the right amenities, facilities, space, etc., which is not the case for most people in the world. So this housing advisory was quite fascinating for me because it showed that having a home was literally the difference between life and death, in the context of COVID-19. So far more important than even having food. So you could die even if you have food or not, don't have food, you could still die of COVID-19 because you don't have enough capacity to do social distancing. Um, and the other part of what was fascinating about COVID-19 that year was not the disease and its impact, but what the government suddenly were able to do. Government after government around the world found the political will and the backbone to deal with structural issues which housing rights advocates have been calling attention to, including pandemic or evictions, which had been besetting the countries for years. But suddenly there were eviction bans in place, and the moratoria, for, again, not just eviction, but rental increases were suddenly put in place. And believe it or not, during that year, the rate of evictions and the rate of people being ending as homeless. By the way, there were aggressive actions to house people who were in the situation of street homelessness by governments around the world who always said that they didn't have the resources to deal with homelessness. But boom, 3 months later, all problems solved. There is nobody on the streets. So it showed more than anything else through almost like a case study run that look, these problems exist, but they are solvable. What is missing is the political will. Because the political will during COVID-19 came out of compulsion. But we have to ask, is that what it is going to take for all of us to face the prospect of death for many of our problems to be solved? Or is there a better way to think about it? So there is quite a lot I learned during that year about the the utter vacuousness of justifications about how housing is a huge structural problem that cannot be solved quickly. Come on, folks. So give me a better story. So the other issues that crept up on the agenda, or rather, I wanted to deal with were not just the phenomenon of homelessness, but its increasing criminalization. It's not just that there are a lot of homeless people and the numbers are increasing year after year, but that people who are on the street were being treated as criminals, performing even everyday tasks like sitting or sleeping outside suddenly led to them facing fines and worse in jail terms. And that seemed like a completely it's not just against human rights, it's just indecent to do. And I really wanted to contribute to that, and that joined the ongoing civil society campaign to decriminalize homelessness and poverty and status, because criminalizing homeless persons is also one of the most direct ways in which poor people are criminalized, because most people who end up as homeless also tend to be those who belong to lower status or who belong to the who tend to be in the poorer classes. So The other issues that I was going to focus on were, of course, the climate crisis and its the central impact of the climate crisis on housing, both the fact that you know that increasing ocean levels or desertification or the increased risk of floods, for example, were going to lead to tremendous impacts on housing, with people being forced to flee, with their homes getting submerged, and so on. But also the increasing impact of heat on habitability of housing. The number of people who are dying during exceptionally warm summers, and this summer promises apparently to be yet another one thanks to the El Nino. So we'll see if that happens, but it's a huge issue. The climate crisis' impact on housing, but I also wanted to write about the impact of housing itself on causing the climate crisis, particularly the question of emissions, which is not an issue that, first of all, housing rights advocates don't want to talk about that because it directly goes against the logic of build more housing. If you see the housing crisis as something that results from shortage of housing, then it's counterproductive for a housing rights advocate to say, yeah, build more housing, but just be careful about the emissions, because it's like shouldn't be yourself in the foot to say, just build housing the most careful way. That's not a powerful, straightforward message. They never talk about the negative, anything negative about building more and more housing. In fact, when I put out the call for inputs and asked housing rights groups as well about what might be some of the downsides of current housing policy approaches, including a commitment to build large numbers of housing, for example. I got zero responses from housing rights groups globally, zero. So it shows again the wide gulf that exists between climate change groups that advocate reduction of emissions and housing rights groups. They're like two trains traveling on a parallel track. They never meet. Okay. So climate crisis seems to be one where I thought I had something useful to say. So I wrote a report on that. Then there is the question of armed conflict. Oddly enough, armed conflict increasingly leads to devastating impact on the built environment. Homes are the first thing that to get destroyed, and the most vivid illustration of that was of the complete pulverization of Gaza. Over 90% of the homes destroyed. But we've seen that in other conflicts as well. In Ukraine, the total destruction of Mariupol, for example, or we've seen that of course, we are seeing that in Myanmar and in Sudan, and one could go on. Now, the fact that homes get destroyed in conflict has been, of course, starting with World War II, with the destruction of Dresden or London, or the firebombing of so many cities. But the level, the scale, and the extent of destruction, as well as the rapidity with which destruction happens, is of a different magnitude in the current era. And that's because of several developments. The primary one is the increased urbanization of the planet. Far more people are living in urban built environments compared to World War II, for example. So if you take Gaza, 77% of Gaza was urban in character. There are a bunch of, loosely located villages, out in the rural areas. They were living in a dense, built environment. So when you start hitting people where they are, you're hitting really the built environment. And that causes a lot of rubble and the damage, as we saw. And the rubble still there that have been removed. And so the main issue, the first issue is urbanization of the planet. As the planet becomes more and more urban, we are seeing more and more negative impacts from conflict. Because conflict, results in destruction of the built environment. The other part of what is causing a lot more damage now is also the rapidity of destruction using improved, or in the eyes of military planners, improved ways of destroying things. One is the use of artificial intelligence for targeting, and the other is the use of multi-headed cluster bombs, essentially bombs that can actually distribute widely across an area and cause destruction far more widely in a very rapid amount. We saw that when the Iran war started, in the first 24 hours, more than 1,000 targets were hit. Now, military planners, any military planner can tell you who is familiar with older forms of targeting that speed of targeting and executing the bombing is simply not possible without the use of artificial intelligence. In Gaza, I did a report on the destruction of Gaza, Myanmar, Ukraine, and Sudan to the Human Rights Council this March. And one of the things I found in the case of Gaza was the use of artificial intelligence platforms, including a platform cruelly named Where's Daddy? So, I mean, these are actually being used, and this has led to an unprecedented destruction of housing in conflicts, which then raises the issue of if economic, social, cultural rights are human rights, and if they destroyed it en masse like this, what's the international legal community doing about it? What's the response? Do the old frameworks about thinking about economic and social, cultural rights work anymore? Seeing them as not as binding or aspirational obligations, subject to not immediate realization, for example, under the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. What does that tell us, really? Is there even a general comment, for example, not to the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant about the applicability of the covenant during armed conflict? And I found there wasn't. So one of the things I have been pushing for over 2 years is folks who say that they're international legal experts, the gatekeepers of the system, if they're serious about these issues, they need to actually say something. They need to put out something more formal. Thankfully, now the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has decided to put issue a general comment on armed conflict. So there was a call for inputs, and I hope some of you had a chance to submit to that as well. So the question of conflict became a major issue. I mean, I wrote the report to the General Assembly on that when Russia was pulverizing Ukraine. And when I presented at the GA, virtually all Western countries warmly welcomed it. They said, what a wonderful report by the Special Rapporteur. And this is so critical. We have to take it seriously, et cetera, et cetera. 1 year later, Gaza was beginning to be pulverized. And I stood up before them and I said, folks, last year, same time, I came to you about Ukraine. But this year, see what's going on in Gaza. Total silence. Total. Across the room. Okay? From the defenders of human rights. So one was, another issue was conflict. The other issue on which I wrote a report is on migration. As I said at the beginning of the remarks, there is an affordable housing crisis, but the way it is being sort of, shall we say, politically reframed, especially in the global north countries, is to blame the migrants for this problem. And I really wanted to write a report calling attention to a brutal fact, which is that housing crises, if they exist, they are almost always the result of your own policy choices and institutions. They have nothing to do with a few migrants coming across the border. The numbers simply don't add up. The impacts don't add up. And the reality is that there is a politics to the way in which the migration issue is being used. And I was able to have a very clear message about this. I was invited by the government of Netherlands to do an official country visit at the end of 2023. When I landed in the country, when the far-right party led by Geert Wilders had won the election, and the main issue in the election was affordability again, of everything. The Dutch were upset, especially about housing. They voted for Geert Wilders because he said, I'll solve all your problems, and the housing problem in particular is caused by migrants. By migrants, by the way, he didn't mean a very large number of Ukrainians who had also come to the Netherlands, but a few Syrians and Afghanis, the folks who look different. So, and this kind of racist framing always succeeds brilliantly in politics. And so he was able to win temporarily in his thing, because as you know, it did work in the longer term. The government hasn't quite been formed. Instead, we have a different government now. But I landed there in December, and I said, frankly, I looked at the numbers and the reality on the ground, and I said that this is total nonsense. This is a wrong message. You do have a housing problem. Well, let me talk to you about the real root causes of the housing problem. It's got nothing to do with migrants. So it landed really quite powerfully, that intervention. And I called for many immediate reforms to address the real root causes of the system, including the reconstitution of the Ministry of Housing, which had been disbanded in 2012, because the Dutch also fell for this idea that housing is a commodity and should be governed by the market, and that they can kind of reverse decades and decades of that, Netherlands' own history by abandoning, for example, a commitment to social housing. But I'm glad to say that 3 months after my recommendation, the ministry was constituted again. So at least somebody's listening, so which is good. After migration, I wanted to really look at the question of resettlement. Resettlement, it's a problem that arises in the context of all evictions, forced evictions, especially large-scale evictions or relocations of communities. Now, forced evictions themselves have been recognized for a long time as a principal human rights concern and a major violation of the right to adequate housing. But the problem has always been, and I've always felt it since my days working with the World Commission on Dams in the 90s, that then the tendency often to think about eviction as an event. If you ask eviction, the image that comes to people's mind is on such and such a day in this location, so many people got pushed out of their homes, which is true. But the tragedy didn't begin on that day, nor does it end on it. It's not a snap one. It's not like a one-day event. In fact, eviction notices are given months, often years in advance, and people are living in panic or under psychological stress, and their property values, by the way, decline immediately. So there's a notice is given, and they can sell their homes very often. They can't move because the area is designated as possibly at risk of evictions. The impacts are ongoing for months or years. And then finally, when the eviction happens, the second tragedy follows, which is that no one really cares about what happens to them after the eviction. The media arrives on the day of eviction because you see it's an important event that has to be covered by media. The human rights groups submit petitions, etc. But then they all move on to the next crisis. The problem is that the people who've been evicted, they end up living somewhere else, unnamed, unnoticed, and they decline into more poverty and marginalization. And the kids cannot suddenly go to even the terrible schools that they were attending. Now there are no schools. Or the jobs that they had before, where there were terrible jobs, now there are no jobs because they've been shifted 40 kilometers away in an area, by the way, which is subject to more floods, for example. So you're really talking about an increasing sort of, marginalization and deliberate impoverishment of a community. Now, there is an area of studies where this has been well documented and known for years, which is two areas, I would say. One is applied anthropology, and the second is development studies. Well known, well documented for years, and in fact, it is taken seriously as a major failure. And the international development organizations like the World Bank have specific policy frameworks, what we call soft international law standards, that seek to kind of reduce the harm by laying down minimum standards for resettlement. But from an international human rights perspective, somehow you've never even recognized it as a problem. There are zero standards when it comes to resettlement. So I actually highlighted the issue over 2 reports. I also submitted a guiding principles on resettlement, which is the first internationally relevant legal standard in the human rights system. So let me conclude then, maybe because I think it's been over half an hour, by saying that what I've tried to do also when engaging with many of these dimensions of the global housing crisis as an international lawyer is to fully and acutely recognize the critical role that international law has played historically in the creation of many of these problems themselves. especially international has been central in, for example, creating the problem over the lack of security or tenure of so many people around the world. And that's because of the colonial era influence of international law on notions of acquisition of land and territory, and of course of territorial sovereignty and the legal doctrines domestically that are embedded in them, like eminent domain. So historical examples are too many, but you can think of even the notions of historians like Emmerich Vattel and his approach to thinking about what is really land about, what is territory, and to him, the only land that is worth protecting under international law is one where cultivation is possible, agriculture. So if you're nomads or if you're indigenous people who are not capable of cultivation, then you just don't enjoy the protection of international law. And this literally a functionalist or developmentalist approach to thinking about land, for example, was directly relied on by domestic courts due to the nature of settler colonialism. So the founding doctrine of property and sovereignty in the United States, for example, was laid down by Chief Justice Marshall in the Johnson versus McIntosh case in 1823, where he directly relies on courts of battle to the effect that, oh, by the way, these Native Americans or Indies, as they were called, have no title to territory because they don't cultivate the land like we do in Europe. We understand agriculture. These people are not agriculturists. So that's literally a quotation from Vattel. Okay. So I just wanted to say that these historical dimensions I was quite acutely aware of. But during my mandate, I was able to see how this history is not some dead thing from the past. To contemporary resonance, many colonial laws are still in force in the law books of countries that were colonized. The 1894 Land Acquisition Act, drafted by Britain during British colonialism, is still operational in Pakistan. In India, it was reversed in 2013, but replaced by another law. Still not fully operational, but at least the law has been reversed. You see the colonial impacts of conceptions about terra nullius, for example, operating in the land acquisition strategies of Israel in occupied Palestinian territories. In the case of Bedouins, for example, Israeli courts constantly rely on the so-called Mawad doctrine, the dead land doctrine, to dispossess Bedouins of their possession. All of that comes from really colonial era assumption. But right now, I just don't want to say that the problem is just historical. International law didn't only create the historical conditions for the poor enjoyment of right to adequate housing today. It continues to reinforce the contemporary framework of international law in ways that make it almost always an impossible task that looks alluringly close but never can be achieved. So we're all running 2 steps behind always. It's almost like there was an artery to race and we were asked to start, a few seconds later. So we're always running behind on this. And there are huge issues, including, for example, the poor protection of rights during armed conflict, as I said, for which I proposed a term called domicide to capture, the extensive human rights impacts that are caused when homes are destroyed on a mass basis. So there is quite a lot one could talk about, but let me stop here and happy to discuss more. I just want to also say that in the end, I've talked a lot about the doctrine part, the history part, and so on, but the system part is also very important. The one thing I want to say, because I came out of the system now, is that the system or the human rights system as it has been designed in the UN itself is part of the ways in which contemporary international law continues to contribute to the prevention of the realization of the right to adequate housing. It deliberately makes it impossible. And one of the ways it does is by creating the kind of structure and system that I was part of. And I can say a lot more about it. But the system is just not credible or or strong enough to make a meaningful difference. It's I don't want to say it's cosmetic, but it can have significant impacts. Like I said, I can give you many examples of actual impacts that I've had as a rapporteur, but it's just left me feeling like this is a deliberate policy choice by countries to keep the system always weak, or at least not strong enough so that it won't really get in the way of the thing that really matters, which is to protect the interests of the most powerful in the world. So we leave it at that.